Regardless of how much you love or hate football, it is absolutely undeniable that its appeal is universal and that its power in modern day society is immense. As an obvious consequence of this, its influence has transferred over to politics, such as with Marcus Rashford's campaign to end child hunger and Megan Rapinoe openly voicing her dissent towards soon-to-be ex-President Donald Trump. It even manages to transcend over to a much more serious area than that in the form of war, with an example of this being Didier Drogba upon Ivory Coast's qualification for the 2006 World Cup, calling for peace in the country instead of celebrating the historic moments with the players. There is one instance, however, that goes beyond all of that, as instead of attempting to end the war or bring humanitarian aid or peace to a region or a country in question, it supposedly did quite the opposite, as it bears its name on a short-lived conflict in the late 1960s, as football was seen as a potential instigator in the start of the conflict. The 1969 war between Honduras and El Salvador has been dubbed the Football War, owing to the close links that the sport reportedly had to the start of the conflict. But is this an accurate representation, and does that title, or epithet if you rather, truly reflect what the conflict was actually about and why it started? In this video, I'm going to give you the set-in-stone facts of what we absolutely know for certain concerning the war, and then subsequently analyse them and determine whether or not it is actually fair to call this conflict the Football War, as well as give you the aftermath for both countries, both in the political and footballing context. So without further ado, let's get into it. Honduras and El Salvador are two countries which lie next to each other in Central America, with the former 5 times larger in landmass, but the latter having a 40% higher population at the time. The dearth of fertile ground, or indeed space for that matter, affected those in the agricultural business in El Salvador significantly, and the policies towards farmers were extremely harsh, as the country was ruled by a working elite who did not take kindly to the working class individuals and treated them poorly, with some even being left landless. As a result of this, a large number of them moved to Honduras in search of more fertile ground or different jobs such as working in factories in order to gain a better living, and it was estimated that by 1969 around 300,000 Salvadorian farmers had emigrated to their neighbouring country. However, they wouldn't be welcomed with open arms as they may have expected, but instead they were treated with perhaps even more brutal animosity than before. In 1966, the Federación Nacional de Agricultores y Ganaderos de Honduras, literally translated as the National Federation of Farmers and Livestock Farmers of Honduras, was set up by a coalition of many large companies, including United Fruit, who own 10% of the land within the country. Their policies were anti-peasant and anti-Salvadorian, which was a double whammy for the livelihoods and prosperity of those who had moved to the country to escape similar policies in their homeland. Just not the anti-Salvadorian bit. I think that may have been a bit strange. Pressure was then put on the president of Honduras from both the coalition and Honduran peasants, who were themselves imploring the government to provide them with more land to work on, to implement the land reform policies which had been promised a while ago. He did so in 1967, and with it came a wave of national fervour and triumph, which was taken out mercilessly on the Salvadorian immigrants. The Honduran population subjected them to mass violence and rape, and the land which they would have acquired was redistributed away from them to the Honduran population. The inevitable consequence of this was that the president demanded that every single one of the 300,000 Salvadorian immigrants return home, passing that law in 1969. Of course, this led to problems within El Salvador, as they did not have the space to welcome them back, and tensions would be further heightened when, in February 1969, a 2-year accord on safe cross-border passage wasn't renewed. For the Salvadorians who stuck around, they would receive a message with the following statements on it. Quote, "Guanaco, if you believe yourself decent, then have the decency to get out of Honduras. If you are, as the majority are, a thief, a drunkard, a lecher, a crook, or a ruffian, don't stay in Honduras. Get out or expect punishment." Close quote. Guanaco is a slang term for someone from El Salvador, referring to the animal of the same name, and supposedly implying that, much like the animal, the Salvadorian population are lazy. Needless to say, the Salvadorian populace do not take kindly to being called a guanaco. Whilst all of this was going on at the forefront of international policies between the two nations, the World Cup qualifying for the 1970 tournament in Mexico had just gone underway. FIFA allotted just one place to teams from the CONCACAF region, which consists of teams from North and Central America and the Caribbean, and the 12 teams who took part in it would be split into 4 groups of 3. The winners of groups 1 and 2, likewise 3 and 4, would play each other in the semi-finals, before the winners of those 2-legged matches would play each other in the final to determine who got that coveted spot in Mexico. As fate would have it, Honduras and El Salvador were drawn into groups 3 and 4 respectively, and should they have won their separate groups, they would meet each other in the semis, meaning that, contrary to maybe popular belief, and certainly something that I believed for a while, the match would not determine who would qualify for the World Cup. Honduras dominated their group, winning 3 and drawing 1 of their 4 group games against Costa Rica and Jamaica, and El Salvador would do the same, winning each of their first 3 games against Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles to ensure a safe passage into the next round, although they were battered 4-1 by Suriname in their last game, but by which point they had already qualified, so it didn't really matter that much. This meant, for those who might not have been able to somehow work it out yet, that the two nations, at the moment when the tension between them was at boiling point, would play each other for a spot in the final of the qualification process to be played against Haiti. The first leg was to be played in Honduras, and the El Salvador players were denied sleep that night as a result of the Honduran locals making a racket outside of their hotel. Whilst they would put up a good showing despite their less than ideal pre-match preparations, the Hondurans would end up winning that game with an 89th minute goal, giving them an advantage going into the second leg, since the match was determined by an aggregate points total and not an aggregate goals total. Fans continued to clash in the stands both during and after the game, but something far more tragic was to occur in the immediate aftermath of the final whistle. In El Salvador, an 18-year-old called Amelia Bolaños, a fervent football fan, was unable to take the pain of seeing her country lose to Honduras. When the final whistle blew, she grabbed her father's pistol and shot herself in the heart. Her death was treated as a martyrdom act by the El Salvador press, with El Nacional splashing her image on the front page of their newspaper and quoted as saying, "This young girl could not bear to see her fatherland brought to its knees." Her funeral was even televised, and the El Salvador players would carry her casket in an attempt to stir up patriotism and even more hostility towards the Honduran populace. The El Salvador fans would somehow cause even more disturbances for the Honduran players, who were aggressively accosted almost from the minute they touched down in the country than their rivals had done to their players. The hotel that the Honduran players overnighted in was absolutely wrecked, with even a pig's head being thrown through a window. If you thought Barcelona fans throwing a pig's head at Luis Figo whilst he was taking a corner was bad, this was somehow even worse. However, in order to potentially alleviate tensions, the team bus was not attacked en route to the match, and the Honduran flag was held up in all its glory in the stadium. Of course, that wasn't the case, as the players had to actually be transported to the match in a tank, with pictures of Bolaños being waved around by the locals along the way, and the Honduran flag had actually been burnt prior to the anthems being played and replaced with a dirty rag. The game, somehow, despite continued violence in the stands and of course all the troubles which the Honduran players had to endure along the way, still went ahead, with El Salvador winning 3-0 to set up a playoff at a neutral venue. After the match, the Honduran manager told his players that they were lucky that they lost, and they had to escape their hotel and spend the night in their embassy, but they managed to make it back alive. Tragically, 2 fans wouldn't be so fortunate. The playoff would take place in Mexico, and perhaps for the safety of both sets of supporters and players, this was the best case scenario. Between the second and third games, however, perhaps intertwined with the loss, the belligerence of the Honduran population towards the Salvadorian immigrants increased significantly, even going so far as burning down their homes should the Salvadorian immigrants remain in Honduras. Anywhere from 11,000 to 17,000 Salvadorian immigrants would flee home by the time the playoff kicked off on the 26th of June 1969. Some sources say that El Salvador dissolved diplomatic ties with Honduras on the day of the game and some the day after, but what is irrefutable is that they were severed in the immediate vicinity of the game taking place. It was played out with both sides knowing that not only was national pride at stake, but also the potential safeguarding of their lives. By halftime, it was 2-1 to El Salvador, but Honduras would respond with a 50th minute equaliser, and as no goals followed over the next 40 minutes, the players had to soldier on for an extra 30 minutes of extra time. 11 minutes later, Mauricio Rodriguez of El Salvador was on the end of a cross to stab the ball home, and the Salvadorians would hold out to win the game 3-2 to book their place in the final against Haiti. This only served to increase the bile reserved for the Salvadorian immigrants, as though they had anything to do with the match in question, and within 3 weeks of El Salvador dissolving their diplomatic ties with Honduras, they declared war on them on the 14th of July 1969. I'm not going to go into the finite details of the war, but what I will say is that it only lasted 100 hours, and it concluded after the Organization of American States, hastily meeting in an attempt to put to an end the conflict before it spiraled out of control, demanded that El Salvador cease its attacks on Honduras. Originally, they refused, stating that they wouldn't unless they received war reparations, but eventually they agreed on the 18th of July, although they didn't remove their troops completely until August the 2nd. 6,000 people were killed and a further 15,000 people were injured. So having given you all the facts about the war and how the match is linked in to the potential instigation of the conflict, here is where the analysis part starts to kick in. I don't know whether this particular point is pertinent in the grand scheme of things, but both Honduras and El Salvador's most popular sport is football, and neither team had actually qualified for the World Cup prior to 1970, meaning that this game, certainly with the political context removed from the equation, still had the potential for something huge. As implied earlier, and as we have seen from the involvement of dictators within football, the sport has the potential to be of immense power over the citizens of a particular country, and it is an extremely useful propaganda tool, a means around which the people can be united in order to generate some more jingoism. Here, it was all too evident, especially given what was made out of Bolaños' suicide by the El Salvador population, the riots which took place in the stands during the games, and the increased intensity of fury and anger towards the El Salvador immigrants by the Honduran public upon El Salvador winning their 2 games. Of course, the hostilities had existed beforehand, but the fact that they ramped up a notch after the defeats despite the migrants having absolutely nothing to do with it whatsoever shows how much the matches in question meant to the 2 nations. I'm not quite sure how much this transferred over to the political context and whether or not the separate countries' politicians felt the same way as the general public, but the fact that El Salvador dissolved their diplomatic ties with Honduras on the day of, or the day after, the playoff game cannot be treated as mere coincidence. Even with all that considered, I just don't think it is right to call what took place between these 2 nations a football war for a few reasons. For starters, the antagonism between the 2 nations had existed long before, and indeed continued to exist long after, the 3-legged tie had taken place, and whilst those games were undoubtedly an opportunity to put one over their sworn enemies, you could say the same thing about any particular rivalry, even though it is highly unlikely that Man United and Liverpool will go to war over each other. Although the less said about Boca and River Plate, the better. Furthermore, El Salvador's statement upon their diplomatic separation revealed the reason for their decision, in that they believed that Honduras had, quote, done nothing to prevent murder, oppression, rape, plundering, and the mass exploitation of Salvadorians, close quotes, further citing their lack of suitable punishments dished out to the main perpetrators and money paid in reparations to the country. Football, perhaps obviously, was nowhere to be seen in the statements, perhaps as it may have been perceived as petty to involve a sport in making such a significant decision, but in all likelihood it's because they didn't see it in any way as important. They may have taken into account the behaviour of the Honduras fans in the games in question in their statements, although from what I gather, the riots are incited by both sets of fans as opposed to just one, so it would be unjust and probably inaccurate to make such claims. If you really were to involve the matches in some way to give some indication as to why the war started, the least tenuous explanation would probably be that it was the straw that broke the camel's back, like for example Archduke Ferdinand's murder in 1914 which triggered the Great War, or Hitler's invasion into Poland in September 1939, forcing the Allies to act and declare war on Germany. However, you don't hear World War I being referred to as the Franz Ferdinand War, nor do you ever think that World War II should ever be called the Poland War, or, if you want to be less snappy, the war started by an invasion into yet another country by the Nazis war. It just doesn't have quite the same ring to it, does it? The point that I am making here is that there is always a myriad of issues which lead to an outbreak of a conflict, be it economical, ideological, or moral, and it isn't solely the result of one crisis or source of tension. If that were to be the case, we probably would have waged a nuclear war on North Korea by now, and I think we can all agree that wouldn't be a smart idea for anyone involved. So why do we call it the football war? Well, to be honest with you, I'm not sure, but here is my own personal hypothesis. People want to refer to things by something which is memorable, snappy, and easy to recognise and identify with. World War I and its sequel are called that because they involve countries the world over. Naming of civil wars mostly consists of sticking the nation who is engaging in battle with itself before the Civil War title, and the Falklands War, just as a random example, is named as such since not only did it take place in the Falklands, but it was about who are the rightful owners of the region. For the most part anyway. Given that a high-profile match between the 2 nations took place in the lead-up to the conflict, someone somewhere must have made that particular connection and decided that the war should be named in honour, or dishonour if you prefer, of the beautiful game, something which many outsiders in this particular context would perceive to be immaterial. It creates an epithet which is straight to the point and entices many other people to learn about it, considering football's magnitude, therefore meaning that it is probably a case of exceptionalism, as this is such an isolated incident that it may as well be named after the sport with which it is most strongly associated. I really don't think, for example, that cricket has the power to start a war, although I could be wrong, although obviously I hope I'm not. It is also called the 100 Hours War, given that it lasted around 100 hours, and I think that is the title to which we should refer this particular conflict instead of the football war, because whilst the games were undoubtedly a source of mass tension, violence and patriotism, they probably didn't contribute to the wider political inklings and decision making of the 2 countries in question. All things considered, it shouldn't really be the case that football has the right to be on the name of any conflict, certainly one where, in the grand scheme of things, it didn't really have much to do with why war was waged in the first place, but at the end of the day, as I say, it does create something memorable, and as such, we've stuck with it ever since. I hope that, maybe with this video and other writings on the topic, that will change in the future, and we simply refer to it as the 100 Hours War and remove football completely from the equation. El Salvador and Honduras have maintained bitter relations between each other for a long time, with certain border disputes still a cause of tension to this day, including in the Gulf of Fonseca, as despite the International Court of Justice awarding most of it to Honduras in 1992, El Salvador were, perhaps understandably, dissatisfied with the outcome, even sending a letter threatening military action to Honduras again as late as 2013. The immigrants returning to El Salvador would be unable to find places to live in once more, and the country would be ravaged again as a result of a civil war between 1979 and 1992, with overpopulation and subsequent lack of space to grow crops cited as key reasons for its instigation. Back into a footballing context, El Salvador would actually go on to beat Haiti and made it to the World Cup tournament in Mexico, but unfortunately they would lose all 3 games to the hosts, Belgium and the USSR, by a combined scoreline of 9-0. Their second would come in 1982, but unfortunately they suffered the ignominious fate of being the only World Cup team to concede 10 goals in one game, falling 10-1 to Hungary. They would lose their other 2 games 1-0 to Belgium and 2-0 to Argentina, having the worst record out of any team in the entire tournament for the second time in 2 attempts. They haven't qualified for any more since. Honduras, meanwhile, qualified for their first World Cup also in 1982 alongside El Salvador, 2 years after a peace treaty between the two nations was finally signed in Lima in Peru. They, like their neighbours, are yet to win a game in 3 attempts, drawing twice and losing once in 1982, drawing once and losing twice in 2010, and then failing to pick up a point in Brazil in 2014. Although unlike El Salvador, not only have they actually drawn games, but they've also not lost by a 9-goal margin. So who's the real winner? That just about concludes today's video on the football war, or the 100 Hours War actually, as I should probably refer it to, considering I've criticised its being called a football war in the first place, but there you go, it's on the title of this video, so yeah, that's that really. If you did enjoy this mini podcast style video or mini documentary, however you want to call it, please do hit that like button, share it around if you can, and subscribe while you are at it. You can also follow me on all my social medias such as Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. They are all linked down below. But thank you very, very much for watching. I really do hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, I'll see you then.